fait ça là ou là pour l'ouverture?
Comme ça, le ministre sera déjà là.
Ok, ok. Oui, je vais être très court, hein, juste ouais, deux minutes, une minute.
Parce que le ministre sera déjà là et
Oui, oui, mais le fait qu'il y ait la conférence haute.
Ça va, vous allez bien?
Oui, oui, très
Bonjour.
bien. Bonjour, bonjour. Je crois que je vais faire une présentation très
Oui,
courte.
très bien,
puis,
parfait.
Welcome everybody to this conference on carbon border adjustments for climate. It's hosted here at the Finance Ministry in Paris. After the introductions, we'll have three sessions, debate sessions. First of all on carbon leakage, then on the challenges facing these carbon border adjustment mechanisms, and lastly on how they can be compatible with world trade rules and the WTO. But first of all, it's a great pleasure to introduce Bruno Le Maire, the Finance Minister of France, whom many of you already know, to open this conference. Bruno.
Thank you. First of all, I will have a few words in French, simplement pour remercier les équipes de la direction du Trésor, au ministère des Finances, qui ont beaucoup travaillé sur cet événement. Donc je tiens à les remercier pour la qualité de leur travail et de leur engagement. Dear Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to co-host this international event together with Barbara Pompili, Minister for the Ecological Transition, and Jean-Yves Le Drian, Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs. First of all, let me thank our high-level speakers and the very numerous attendees for seizing this opportunity to discuss the vital issue of carbon leakage and carbon border adjustment mechanisms. 5 years ago, here in Paris, world leaders agreed to avoid dangerous climate change by limiting global warming. That is the Paris Agreement. As a first milestone, many countries, including France and all EU member states, have endorsed a common objective of achieving climate neutrality by mid-century. The European Union recently increased to 55% its target of net greenhouse gas emission reductions for 2030. It gives a strong positive signal of our commitment to other economies. I strongly welcome US official return to the Paris Agreement. The soon-to-be announced enhancement of the US climate ambition is a very promising step in the context of the upcoming COP26 in Glasgow next November. France is strongly committed to decarbonizing its economy and reaching carbon neutrality by 2050. Over the past years, greenhouse gas emissions have been declining. We must still speed up the dynamic. It's time to speed up the dynamic. The current crisis should be a wake-up call for us all to invest massively for a sustainable economy. France has allocated a significant share of its recovery plan to the greening of our economy. We have a very clear objective: to speed up the transition towards a low-carbon economy in order to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. 1/3 of the 100 billion plan France Relance is devoted to 4 main green priorities: energy efficiency and renovation of buildings, decarbonized transport, agricultural transition, and low-carbon energy production. At European level too, the recovery plan features high green ambition with a 37% target for climate expenditure. It also foresees that 100% of investments made under the European Recovery Plan have to be consistent with the do no harm principle, meaning that no expenditure should undermine environmental objectives. Yet, the climate ambition of recovery packages differ across countries. We could collectively do more. We should collectively do more. The European Union will strengthen its climate policies to deliver on the new -55% emission reduction objective for 2030. This entails a strengthening of its carbon pricing policy via the emissions trading system, which now covers almost half of the EU's greenhouse gas emissions. Carbon price has recently crossed the symbolic threshold of 40 euros per tonne of CO2. However, when levels of carbon pricing differ between countries or differ between regions, there is a risk of what we commonly call carbon leakage from regions where carbon price is high to the ones when it is much lower or where there is no carbon pricing. To date, very few economies have a carbon price level that is consistent with the ambition of the Paris Agreement. Indeed, more than 3/4 of global emissions do not face carbon pricing. This is inefficient and this is unfair. Let me be clear. This is not sustainable, both from an environmental and from a social acceptance point of view. To be climate effective, and this is our political purpose, the commitments we take must not lead to reallocation of the production and translate into increased greenhouse gas emissions elsewhere, polluting more elsewhere. To produce the goods we need here makes no sense. It would mean our efforts have no impact on climate change, that they are meaningless and not useful. Yet, as we collectively strengthen our climate commitments, the already significant divergence in ambition with third countries is likely to widen even further. As a consequence, the phenomenon of emission transfer that I describe, which correspond to carbon leakage, is very likely to intensify. Ladies and gentlemen, carbon leakage, which a few years ago was still dismissed as a fantasy by some, is now becoming a roaring reality for all of us. We estimate carbon leakage to be in the range of 5 to 30%. In other words, for every 10 tons of emission reduction in the country or region implementing ambitious climate policies, emissions in the rest of the world increase by half a ton to 3 tons. Without appropriate measures, carbon leakage will hinder and jeopardize our efforts to reduce emissions. Addressing carbon leakage is also a matter of fairness towards third countries, because in the end, it is not fair, it is not efficient, it is not sustainable to transfer part of our burden of reducing emissions to other countries. I'm sure Commissioner Gentiloni will come back to that later. We do know that existing EU instruments to tackle carbon leakage, such as free allowances in the European carbon market, although they are currently necessary for our industry, are bound to ultimately fall short of addressing the issue. Free allowance provide insufficient incentives to implement the EU's new 2030 net emission reduction targets. We need increased decarbonization effort by all sectors, including those at risk of carbon leakage. The implementation of a more effective instrument is therefore vital for all of us. It's time to act and it's time to decide. The EU Commission's proposal to set up a carbon border adjustment mechanism is the right response to this challenge. It is at the core of the European Green Deal. It must be adopted right now to be implemented no later than 2023. It is not the first time we'll discuss a carbon border adjustment mechanism, at least in France. The reason why it was not introduced earlier is because a carbon border adjustment mechanism raises complex issues on which Commissioner Gentiloni is fully aware. I firmly believe it is now time for action. I strongly believe it is now time to decide on this key instrument to fight against climate change. We can work around technical difficulties, there are ways to set up a non-discriminatory instrument that is fully compliant with World Trade Organization's rules. France has already made concrete proposals to overcome the very complex environmental, economic, and political challenges to be addressed in designing and implementing such a mechanism. We are having discussions with our European colleagues and the foundations for an agreement, and they are building fast. This morning, together with fellow ministers of economy, finance, environment, and foreign affairs from Austria, Czech Republic, Denmark, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Slovakia, Spain, and the Netherlands, we publicly reaffirmed in an op-ed published by Politico the need to implement an EU carbon adjustment mechanism that is effective, legitimate, and fair. Effective first, because it could tackle carbon leakage better than existing instruments. Legitimate, because it will be fully compliant with international rules laid down by the WTO, as I have already mentioned, and consistent with the framework of the Paris Agreement. And fair, because it will be implemented in a transparent and coordinated manner with our trading partners without discriminating between domestic and foreign producers. We therefore look forward to discussing Commission's proposal later this year together with other EU member states and the European Parliament. Today, though, is not about focusing on us, Europeans, all the contrary. It is not about the EU against the rest of the world. Carbon border adjustment mechanism should be designed and implemented for the benefit of all and provide an opportunity to enhance international climate coordination. This is why we are gathered here today with renowned panelists from leading international organizations and think tanks, academic experts, and European representatives both from the Commission and the Parliament. First, we will discuss carbon leakage and its implications, not only for the European Union, but also for global climate action. And we will see how relevant carbon border adjustment mechanisms are to fight it. We then want to discuss how such a mechanism can be articulated with the Paris Agreement and with the development needs of the most vulnerable ones. I have said it before, the EU had said it too, no one should be left behind on the long road to a low-carbon economy. Finally, we will discuss the legitimacy of such a mechanism with regard to our duty and commitment to multilateralism, and in particular with the rules of the World Trade Organization. Ladies and gentlemen, dear Commissioner Gentiloni, before leaving you in the hands of our talented panelists for what promises to be a very exciting discussion, let me now give the floor to my dear Paolo, European Commissioner for Economy. Paolo, you have the floor, and thank you for attending this very important international meeting.
Merci Bruno. Oui, mesdames et messieurs, je voudrais premièrement remercier le gouvernement français pour cette initiative de haut niveau et mon ami Bruno Le Maire en particulier. This conference is certainly an important milestone along the way to put in place a carbon border adjustment mechanism in Europe. A Europe that protects facing climate change. This challenge is at the very heart of the economic, health, and global security agenda. It is one of the biggest threats that modern humanity has ever faced. I share the words of the UN Secretary General Guterres, who recently said that making peace with nature is the defining task of the 21st century. Making peace with nature. It means also be aware of what climate change concretely may bring to us. Climate change is projected to increase the frequency of flood events also in large parts of Europe. Economic losses from extreme weather are increasing. In the EU, these losses already average over 12 billion per year. Estimates show that exposing today EU economy to global warming of 3 degrees above the pre-industrial level would result in an annual loss of at least 170 billion. If no action is taken, food productivity is projected to decrease in the Mediterranean area, South Europe, and Central Asia, threatening food security. But there is also good news. We can address these threats together. A renewed multilateralism is our northern star in times of change and interconnected challenges: health, security, climate, economy. So introducing a carbon border adjustment mechanism will support the EU climate ambition. In terms of calendar, we intend to table a proposal on a CBAM, sorry for the acronym, in June 2021 as part of the so-called Fit for 55 package, which will include several initiatives to deliver on our 55% emissions reduction target by 2030. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to underline 3 points on CBAM in order to contribute to today's discussion. First, there is a new global dynamic in favor of climate action on which we need to build. Almost 4 years ago, President Macron said in the amphitheater of the Sorbonne University that Europe must be a pioneer of an effective and equitable ecological transition. With the adoption of the European Green Deal as our new growth strategy in December 2019, we Europeans were the first to pledge to become the first climate neutral continent by 2050. Happily, we are no longer alone in this path. The US are now again in the Paris Agreement, as Bruno just mentioned, and very engaged in the preparation of the COP26 summit that will take place in November. There are also positive developments coming from Japan, South Korea, South Africa, and of course Canada. And China has also given some positive signals. More countries will join. Already today, half of the G20 countries have pledged to achieve some form of climate neutrality by the middle of the century. We need to build on such a global trend to set up joint approaches with like-minded international partners, including by introducing equivalent carbon pricing mechanisms. As an early mover, the EU can become a standard setter in this area. Second, CBAM can be an effective way to address the risk of carbon leakage and avoid a race to the bottom. As long as differences in level of climate ambitions persist across countries, there is a risk of carbon leakage. Put simply, this means that companies may transfer their production to places where decarbonization requirements are less strict and increase their emissions there, thus leading to a global increase of emissions. This is unacceptable. Our workers and businesses should not pay the price if other countries lag behind in the green transition. Climate policies cannot become an element of economic competition and race to the bottom. A carbon border adjustment mechanism by equalizing the carbon price of domestic and imported products, can incentivize foreign producers to invest in greener production processes and third countries to increase their climate ambition. Our work on CBAM began in the very first days of the mandate. The Commission services are currently completing a thorough assessment of the impact of various options for establishing such a mechanism, including a careful analysis of the sectors that could be covered since the beginning. The risk of carbon leakage is higher in certain energy-intensive industries, of course. We have in mind to design our mechanism in a way that allows for an extension of the scope over time. Steel, cement, electricity, fertilizer, and aluminium are among the sector under consideration in this impact assessment. On the design options, although we have not made our choice yet, there is some convergence toward an option mirroring the EU emission trade system. Third and last point, Europe wants to build a solution in cooperation with its international partners and in full compliance with its international commitments. So the Commission is committed to working with the EU trading partners to make sure that the CBAM works in an open and fair manner and is in full compliance with WTO rules. Importers will not be subject to an adjustment that is higher than what applies to domestic EU producers. The Commission is also reflecting on possible ways to support less developed countries. The CBAM will take into account efforts by the EU's international partners to adopt policies and measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, including through carbon pricing mechanisms. CBAM will require robust data on carbon content of imports and will need to account for the degree to which imports are subject to carbon pricing in the country of origin. The ongoing mapping of carbon pricing practices launched under the auspices of the Italian presidency of the G20 will be highly relevant in that respect. Climate diplomacy must act as a driving force. We are committed to stepping up bilateral engagement to this effect, but also to supporting the multilateral process. And I also would like to thank Bruno Le Maire for the op-ed published today with a number of other ministers from France and several member states to support the initiative and build the necessary consensus. It is essential to build on the new global dynamic at play in the run-up to COP26. Together, we can work for a better planet. Thank you.
Grazie. Thank you very much, Paolo Gentiloni. It's Victor Mallet here from Bercy, from the Financial Times, but chairing this meeting. We're now going to thank you very much for those thoughts. Also to Bruno Le Maire for his speech. We're now going to move straight on to the debate part of this conference, and the first session is on carbon leakage. A proven and quantifiable threat to climate ambition. And we're going to try and define the problem that we're dealing with, and that the carbon border adjustment mechanism that the European Union is proposing is designed to deal with, or will try to deal with. If you're in the audience, if you have any questions, you are able, I believe, to put them in the text below the video, and we will pick those up and hopefully put those questions to our panelists. So if you have a question, say who you are, what your question is, and if possible, who you'd like to direct the question to, and we will pick that up after about halfway through this session. I think all the panelists are there, and I'll introduce you as we go along. I'm going to start with Laurence Boone of the OECD. Hello, Laurence. Can you hear me? She's silent. Maybe you have to unmute, or somebody has to do it for you. Just make sure we...
Hi, Vito. Nice to see you.
Great, excellent.
You can hear me now, right?
Yes, I can. Thank you so much, Laurence. Great to see you again, albeit at a distance. I just want to, maybe you could start us off by telling us, what the state of play is on carbon leakage. Is this a peculiarly European problem because Europe is more advanced, perhaps, in its carbon pricing policies? What is the sort of, how much of a problem is it, carbon leakage, for industrialized economies?
Is this for me or for Michael? For me?
Oh, sorry, that's for you, Laurence. Yes, and then we'll move on to Michael in a minute. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Well, as you know, both Bruno Le Maire and Commissioner Gentiloni mentioned, it's obviously a problem that's reflecting increasing and diverging climate ambition. The countries with ambitious climate targets may develop a comparative advantage in low emission production in the medium run, but the issue that they are now facing is that dealing with carbon leakage and the transition cost to this low carbon future might be high at the moment. So to date, the evidence, including a lot of work that we've done at the OECD and will publish very soon in a book, tends to show that climate policies have only had a small effect on carbon leakage and competitiveness, especially when we compare with other determinants of trade and investment location decision, like transport costs or proximity to demand or the quality of local workers. However, we have to admit that these results are based on past climate policies, and they did not have the same level of ambition that some countries like the EU are now proposing. And also, the small effects we have observed so far may to some extent be because climate policies were designed to minimize potential competitiveness effects. For example, the EU ETS, during its first decade of existence, widely allocated emission permits for free. So to start with, I would say that the past results we have are based on modest policy, and they may not be a perfect guide, and we should acknowledge that transition costs to a low carbon economy may indeed intensify with rising climate ambition. So we have already seen, for example, that environmental policy stringency has tripled between 1995 and 2015, but at a different pace across OECD countries. Now, is this a very European issue? I don't think so, because you have more than 100 countries which have declared various carbon neutral ambition in the 21st century. And this divergence in their ambition means that carbon leakage will remain and perhaps increase as a potential issue for many countries outside Europe and within Europe. The minister said that most emissions today are priced too low or not priced at all, and not in a way that's consistent with net zero targets. And obviously, we now expect that to change. Now, that individual countries make effort is obviously welcome, but we know that if carbon prices go up at different rates and in a non-coordinated way, there will be divergence, and therefore the debate around carbon leakage will likely intensify. So you wouldn't expect me to say something else that we need closer global coordination on this, but more specifically, I think it's also very important to consider the winners and losers of policies that would be implemented to minimize carbon leakage at the global level. And the impact on developing countries, for example, is expected to be heterogeneous. In the same way that the green transition would create winners, countries with good solar, wind resources and minerals, and losers, those who have a lot of coal mines and are oil producing countries. So I think we must be very careful that policies that minimize carbon leakage are also accompanied with fair transition policies that support countries and individuals who would be negatively affected by border carbon adjustment mechanisms or green policies. And again, I will see Vitor Gaspar smile again, but this, I think, argues once more for global cooperation rather than unilateral action. So now, just to conclude on your question, let me put that in the context of the health crisis. I think the COVID-19 pandemic is obviously posing major challenges to economies and societies, and it might weigh on economic policies over several years. All those economic recovery programs present an opportunity for governments to build back or build forward better, and obviously to warrant that efforts of meeting climate objectives are not derailed by the pandemic. But we have a few things to take into account. I think first, the ambitions of environmental policies are very often shaped by the fear of adverse effects on the economy, and specifically on employment and industry competitiveness. So for this transformation to support growth, we will need broad-based policy packages that address these concerns, and therefore includes not only carbon price, but also policies supporting technology development and diffusion, as well as these clear price signals. One lesson we've learned from the green recovery packages adopting during the financial crisis was that investment alone is not enough to make the business case for investing in low carbon assets. And as I've just said, often these packages lacked important long-term signals. For example, in the EU, ETS permit prices remained low for many years after the crisis. In the US, attempts to introduce a federal carbon price were abandoned. Yet we know that these long-term signals are necessary for businesses, and for example, the removal of fossil fuel subsidies as well, or clear commitment to the carbon pricing trajectories can help align price signals, and they can make investment into climate mitigation technology more sustainable. So just to finish, that doesn't mean that we should put carbon prices in place instantly, but it means early commitment can really provide forward guidance to investors and reduce uncertainty without immediately burdening businesses with new taxes. And that will help investment in energy technologies because they require long-term planning and policy certainty. If I give you an example, the Swedish carbon pricing policy is, I think, a good practice example. It was increased from 23 euro per ton to 110, which is the highest carbon tax rate in the world, but over 30 years, right? And that managed, as a result, Sweden achieved significant emission reductions and economic growth was healthy. So the political economy and public acceptability of all the discussion that has started here, I think, needs to be taken into account when we are designing such policies, because the difficulty is those tax signals have distributional impacts on people, on firms, and that again may raise further concerns about carbon leakages. So what we would argue is compensation measures and other complementary policies can be used to offset the distributional impact of higher taxes or removal of subsidies, and especially at the national level. For example, the additional revenues generated by market-based policies, they can be used to address the potential distributional impact, to fund environmental innovation and investments, to reduce the tax burden elsewhere in the economy, sometimes even to reduce public deficit. Now, combining these environmental policies with other policies like trade, education, employment, fiscal policy can really help with the challenges associated with the unavoidable negative effect of some environmental policies on the least efficient and most polluting company. So let me stop. I think I've used a lot of speaking time, but just adding that multilateral discussion again may help. One of the main changes that was triggered by the health crisis is that climate as a common concern has increased. And even if the Paris Agreement focuses on national plans to reduce emission, in part because initial positions are different, this time there should be discussion on ETS, on carbon pricing at the multilateral level, and why not starting at the G20? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laurence, for setting that out for us. I'm going to turn to Michael Mehling now, just to give us, maybe just define leakage for us. I mean, I think if you've ever flown over Guangdong on a rare, clear day with no air pollution, you will see that a very large chunk of heavy and indeed light industry from Europe and America has essentially been moved to southern China. So, what exactly do we mean by leakage? And do you agree with the number? It's quite a wide range number that was put out there by Bruno Le Maire just now, saying, so far we're looking at 5 to 30% leakage when you from European actions. I mean, that's a pretty broad range, from almost negligible to a third. So we're talking about a problem of estimation and of accuracy on how bad the problem is. What do you see the problem as of leakage? What is it, and how bad is it?
Thanks, Victor.
Sorry, I should have said Michael. I should have said Michael is at the is the deputy director of the MIT Center for Energy and Environment Policy. I'm sorry, I omitted to introduce you, Michael.
No problem. So thank you, and thanks to the French government to invite me to speak here, and good to see you, Laurence, again. Defining carbon leakage, I'll repeat a few things that I think Commissioner Gentiloni and Minister Le Maire and Laurence indeed have already brought up, but I'll go a little bit deeper on specific issues. So defining carbon leakage very broadly is sort of looking at a situation where you have climate policies in one jurisdiction resulting in an increase in emissions in other jurisdictions that do not have equivalent climate policies in place. The terminology is a bit amorphous, it's heterogeneous, but there's a number of channels that are commonly identified as sort of the ways through which leakage occurs. First, operational leakage, also called production leakage. And that's really, I think, what you just described, Victor. That's the relocation of production from, say, European factories to existing capacities in other countries with a shorter time horizon. These are operational decisions, and it's really affected primarily, if it is climate policy induced, by the policies that are already in place. But there's also this longer term problem of investment relocation, a second channel of leakage, and that's really relocation of new production capacities. So that would be new factories that, instead of being built in Europe for future production, are built elsewhere, if again that is driven by climate policy and carbon costs. And that is, of course, a much more long-term thing that is influenced by expectations of future climate policy, including things like long-term decarbonization targets. There's a third channel that is often also mentioned. I think the paper that you just referenced and that Minister Le Maire referenced describes it as indirect carbon leakage. That's displacement of fossil fuel consumption. So as some jurisdictions start pushing out fossil fuels from their systems and demand declines, that of course exerts downward pressure on the prices for fossil fuels in global markets and may stimulate uptake, may stimulate consumption of these fossil fuels elsewhere.
That's what they call indirect leakage, is that right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So a third channel. And to get to academic research, I think Laurence very rightly pointed out, these relocation decisions, whether it's operational or investment relocation, they are, of course, influenced by a number of different factors, and she mentioned several. And disaggregating, trying to distinguish which of those, which part of those decisions is due to climate policies, which may be due to corporate income taxes or energy costs or labor costs, etc., is really difficult. But research over 20 to 30 years has looked into this quite a bit, and it's become more and more sophisticated in how to try to capture that, to really identify, let's say, the carbon leakage in that. Again, there's a number of studies. They're very different in their approaches and methodologies, the indicators they use, the levels of analysis, firm level, whole countries, etc., geographical and temporal scope. So it's very hard to say, like, this is the consensus. But I think it's useful to look into the distinction between ex post analysis and ex ante analysis, because the results vary quite significantly. And the ex post analysis, now they have the benefit, they're looking backward, if you like. They have the benefit of using empirical data. They use surveys, descriptive approaches, and econometric analysis. And by and large, they have tended to find that leakage has been a relatively moderate problem in the past. But as Laurence mentioned, many of these studies look back to a period where carbon prices were significantly lower. And there's not terribly much studies, for instance, reflecting the growing ambition of climate policy and the growing carbon price in recent years. I was involved in a study for the Finnish Prime Minister's office last year, in which the economists in the group used econometric modeling, and they estimated carbon leakage to be quite significantly higher than many of the earlier studies, in the range of up to 20% based on increased value of imports and the carbon intensity of those imports. But then there's the whole ex-ante analysis, and they try to sort of look into the future. And exactly what Laurence also mentioned, the fact that our climate ambitions are expected, are planned, are already committed to increase dramatically going forward. And with that, for instance, also carbon prices. The problem there is you enter a world of uncertainty. You have to make assumptions about technologies, about terms of trade, of course, also what other countries will do in policies, etc. This is the world where you have CGE modeling, partial equilibrium modeling, etc. And by and large, those studies tend to find or suggest or estimate higher levels of leakage. Some partial equilibrium analysis, for instance, in specific sectors, even suggests up to 100% of leakage, which means that any decrease in emissions domestically would be completely offset by increases elsewhere. But again, it's very, very sort of, we're in the realm of uncertain assumptions there. So there are caveats. But nevertheless, I would say even though past research, so ex post analysis, suggests that it's not been a huge problem in the past, and even though future ex ante analysis are riddled with uncertainties, all in all, I think it still justifies being very concerned about the problem, given that we're talking about rapid increases of ambition in certain jurisdictions in a world of asymmetrical climate effort.
Thank you. And I guess this brings us to the fact that the lack of substantial carbon border adjustment mechanisms anywhere means it's very hard to make an analysis as to what effect, either historical or forward-looking, as to what effect that would have on carbon leakage. And we can talk about the problems of analyzing the carbon leakage that has already occurred, but it's presumably very difficult to work out what effect on that would be had by these carbon border adjustment mechanisms that are being suggested by Europe and probably increasingly by others. Maybe that's the point to bring in Vitor Gaspar from the Director of Fiscal Affairs at the IMF, who can maybe give us some sort of signposts as to what would be the best way to tackle carbon leakage. Is this proposal, albeit still in outline form from the European Union, the right one? Obviously carbon pricing is more widespread than carbon border adjustment mechanisms, but how do you assess this proposal in the context of other big economies like the US and China? Vitor.
Thanks, Victor. Your question is a fantastic question that allows me to go step by step, I believe, in what I think will be a very conceptually transparent way. So if we go to a very simple world in which we want to fight climate change, and the only greenhouse gas that exists is CO2, then the first best way to tackle climate change is through a carbon price that would be a global carbon price. And the only complication that we would have to take into account is uncertainty, time to build, and that would lead to an argument again for certainty and gradualism, very much like Laurence made in her presentation. So that is the first best, and it's a conceptually very clear case. Now, it's very politically unrealistic because we do not have world government, we don't have a world executive that can decide on that. So we have been arguing at the IMF that a way to make pragmatic progress would be to have a global agreement on a carbon price floor, and that could initially involve the largest emitters around the world, and that would be an extremely important step forward. And I believe, again, that that's very much in the spirit of the plea for multilateralism that Laurence made in her intervention. Scaling up carbon pricing is much easier when countries act together, as it reduces the concerns about leakages, competitiveness of particular sectors, and the pricing mechanism allows for a commitment device for countries that can credibly avoid countries reneging on their mitigation commitments. But we are not going to have either a universal carbon price or even a universal carbon price floor agreement. And so from that viewpoint, the carbon border adjustment mechanism appears as a pragmatic alternative. Principles that are fundamental is the maintenance of the playing field. Clean and dirty industries at home and abroad should be treated alike as they contribute to the change of emissions. But when many years ago I was very much involved in European negotiations, I do remember negotiations around VAT tax directives, and VAT works now on the basis of the logic of the destination principle. Now, the carbon border adjustment also has a similar logic, so that production in a given country, say France, is treated exactly the same, irrespective of whether the origin of the good that is traded in France is France itself or some remote country from the other end of the world. But as we have seen with VAT, the devil is in the details. Sectoral coverage, the measurement of the emissions embodied in a particular good, how to coordinate with other countries, how to take into account different approaches to CO2 emissions reductions across countries, how to take into account efforts that are reflected not in pricing mechanisms but regulations. There are many complexities that one has to take into account. And remember, I started with a very strong simplifying assumption. Let's imagine that we care only about CO2. There are many other complications. There are joint products, there are local externalities, and of course, the politics of the international negotiations, what was called already today the international diplomacy of curbing carbon emissions, will have a great role, a central role to play, and a commitment of all to multilateralism and the avoidance of unilateral actions is something which is a great contribution going forward. I hope that you like my little frame, Victor, and I stop here.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, you know, if I can sort of summarize, basically the ideal would be a global carbon price run by the world government, not necessarily the IMF, I presume. But this EU suggestion or proposal is a kind of pragmatic alternative, but this pragmatic alternative has all kinds of potential obstacles that it would have to face. As you said, the devil is in the detail, and that's what we'll come down to in our discussions, I think.
Absolutely, Victor. But when you say that the ideal would be a universal carbon price run by a world government, please don't forget the politics of a world government. For
indeed.
Immanuel Kant, world government would be universal tyranny.
Yeah, well, we have the WTO and the UN, so I guess we should, and the IMF, and we should perhaps, if we're trying to tackle climate change, we need to get some kind of international coordination, as Laurence keeps saying. In fact, I might come to you now, Laurence, back to you, because it is unfortunately a political issue. Your incoming Secretary General, Matthias Carman, in an interview in the Financial Times today, which I'm sure you've seen, has come out essentially against a carbon border tax or carbon border adjustment mechanisms of the type that are going to be presented by the EU in June, exactly when he begins to take office at the OECD. I mean, are there any, what do you see as the possible alternatives, or what would he see, or what does the OECD see as the possible alternatives to this carbon border adjustment mechanism? If we're to get carbon output and greenhouse gases reduced, as everybody claims to want to do, presumably the Europeans, are in advance on this, but they seem to be punished for it by everyone saying this is hopeless and it won't work. How do you see? Do you think there are any alternatives to this EU proposal? Will it eventually end up being the kind of thing that is adopted by everybody, or will there have to be some other way forward?
Thanks for the question. So thanks also to Vitor for quoting Immanuel Kant, and actually I should say that at least half of the thing I know about all this is due to a long conversation with Michael at the time we could travel, this weird pre-pandemic. But let me answer your question, because we have published at the OECD a working paper which shows precisely the joint work of our trade, environmental, tax, and economic department. So trying to have this multiple three, very round overview of the tools that could be used for this. And obviously I can put that in the chat later. There are, a lot of things that can be done, in fact, and I think you could broadly distinguish alternatives under the headings of international coordination once more, but that's all habit of us around here, and unilateral instruments as well. And obviously, technically, they all have advantages and disadvantages, and as everything in life and economic policy, the choice will partially involve trade-off between the environment and the economy that are inherently political. So let me again, in this paper, you will find a really huge table with a possible instrument that can be used for reducing emission while mitigating the carbon linkages problem. And they go from fee-based to international sectoral agreements, something that was mentioned by both the minister and the commissioner earlier on, or taxes on carbon-intensive products. And what I will do with you, if that's okay, is just to contrast two tools, one under the international coordination and one which is more unilateral action. So under international coordination.
Oops, we've lost you a second there, Laurence. Oops. It looks like the whole system is gone, or is it just Laurence we've lost? Vitor and Michael, you're still there? You can still hear me? I think there's a problem with your connection. It's our connection this end. Apologies if you can hear me. We're trying to restore the system. Yeah. Another reason why people don't like Zoom calls. Yeah, it's fine. Oh, they can hear us? They can hear, they can talk to each other, but they can't hear us. Okay, okay. Good. Well, that's better than nothing. So, and the audience can also hear them? Okay, good, yeah. It's not all being transmitted from here then? It's, where is it? So can you log on to, you can log on to YouTube and, oh, okay, maybe I can. Well, they can't, but the audience can't speak, they can only speak to each other, right?
Decarbonization perspective, excise taxes would need to be complemented by additional incentives. Now, relaxing ambitions for trade-exposed firms, which I mentioned at the beginning, can be done by combining a carbon price and free permits, producer compensation, or preferential carbon agreements. Victor, we continued. We assumed that there were people listening to us.
You did the right thing. I'm afraid our connection dropped out, but I believe you were able to still talk to each other, and hopefully the audience was able to hear you. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. So just to sum up, I give one example of an alternative tool under international coordination, which is sector agreement using the maritime agreement. And another example of unilateral tool, which is the excise taxes. And another one is actually relaxing ambition for those firms which are very trade exposed. And what I was telling Victor and Michael, also they know that very well, is this can be done by combining a carbon price with free permits or producers compensation or preferential carbon agreements. And those instruments also have advantages and disadvantages. So on the positive side, they're all WTO compatible, because we all know that BCA will only be WTO compatible once they have been challenged at the WTO. And they can help also reduce those instruments' political opposition to emission trading schemes or carbon pricing. Now, on the negative side, again, they reduce the incentive to abate emission domestically, and they may create threshold effect and a level playing field among firms, obviously. So the bottom line is, I think, as we talked, as I thank Peter for having supported me on this, decarbonization is a global problem. And I think really multilateral discussion will be very helpful. BCA is only one instrument of several available for dealing with carbon leakage while reducing emission. They come with pros and cons. They're complex. Victor mentioned it. They have technical, methodological, political challenges. but they can start the discussion on sectors that need to be decarbonized, because they're not the only measures, and we need to make sure that they will comply with the WTO policies. Now, what I think really counts is finding the most effective instruments to reduce emission globally, while keeping transition costs as low as possible. And this is why this discussion is super helpful. And by the way, I didn't do it at the beginning, but let me thank you for the invitation and the discussion. Really nice.
Thanks. I mean, it's a very, it's a very intriguing discussion, which does get very political. I mean, obviously, international agreements that are all embracing are much better and more effective. But where they are not possible, I mean, for example, we've seen this with world trade. Where people cannot agree in the WTO, they tend to form regional or bilateral trade agreements, which are called free trade agreements, and they're often not very free, but they are kind of bilateral or regional deals. And in some ways, it seems to me that on this issue of carbon border adjustments, the EU is ahead of the game, ahead of the rest of the world, and is therefore being sort of pushed back against by other world powers who are less keen to see it go ahead. I mean, it was interesting to hear Paolo Gentiloni saying that if the EU succeeded, it would end up being a standard setter. And that's obviously not necessarily something that China or the US want. And it may be why there is some resistance. I mean, it wasn't just the incoming Secretary General of the OECD who was speaking out against this. We also had John Kerry of the US urging caution and delay in terms of the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanisms. I just want to, we've got a few questions. We haven't got much time left for this session. And there are a few questions which I am trying to access on my screen, which I've failed to do. Excuse me a second. For each of you, actually, and these are from the audience who are listening around the world. The first one is for Michael Mailing, and it's basically the question is, how do we avoid a bureaucratic monster? And that goes back to some of the things that Vitor Gaspar was saying about the complexities. But the question was for you, Michael. Is this going to lead to a sort of bureaucratic nightmare of the kind we've seen in other areas, and how do we avoid that?
Thanks, Victor. Well, it's a good question. I think there's no doubt that CBAM, or border carbon adjustments, are very complex instruments. In fact, a report that I co-authored with André Marcoux and Aaron Cosby not long ago at the European Roundtable for Climate Change and Sustainable Transition dissects all the complex technical features that have to be that require choices, and each of these choices is interrelated. So I think it would be wrong to say that there's a way to make it very simple. There probably isn't, but I still think that there is the potential to try to keep it to sort of a basic instrument that does not necessarily reflect specific particularities of every single sector and make it extremely complex. Still, there's trade-offs. If you keep it relatively simple by limiting it, for instance, to very upstream basic products, and you don't go far down the value chain, then you potentially have, you just sort of displace the leakage challenge down the value chain, and you will encounter that again further down in those parts, in those stages of the value chain that are not covered. So there's no real simple answer, but I think, and I expect, and I hope that what the European Commission will propose tries to sort of get the maximum effectiveness with the least amount of administrative complexity.
Yeah, they have. I mean, they have suggested that, haven't they? Starting obviously with the high carbon industries, which they already do in their domestic ETS as well. Yeah, steel and cement and that kind of thing. Yeah. There's another question from Silvia Selandari, but I think we've kind of discussed that already with Laurence, which is about whether unilateral or international cooperation systems are better. So I'm afraid we'll do that because we'll miss that because we've already discussed it. There's a question from Benjamin Gorlak, who says, and I think I'll put this to Vitor Gaspar, most major economies have adopted net zero targets, because you mentioned this at the beginning, and an increasing number of countries are moving towards carbon pricing. So is the ambition gap between the EU and its trading partners really widening as much as it appears, or as much as people have been saying?
Thanks, Victor. I do think that there is increasing recognition all around the world that the pricing mechanism has a role to play, both in terms of giving the correct signals to the private sector, which are very important for the allocation of resources to clean technologies in an appropriate way from a static viewpoint, from today's viewpoint, but perhaps even more importantly, to give the right incentives for innovation and technology adoption going forward. That is crucial to move the discussion from minimizing the costs associated with the transition to maximizing the benefits of a green transformation of the economy. That is key. If that is correct, there will be a solid base for trying to coordinate policies going forward based, we hope, on a carbon price floor that could be complemented by a carbon border adjustment mechanism that would be phased in gradually over time, following basically the same logic of the carbon price. But even with those two very important instruments in place, there will be room for other instruments, including regulatory instruments, and what one will be doing with the revenues from the carbon price or the carbon tax is a crucial political decision that must be taken as well. And I'll stop here, Victor.
You mean what's done with the revenues? Obviously the EU wants some members of the EU want this to be part of the own resources of the EU's budget and so on. I mean, if I can just sort of go back to, as I understand what you're saying, is that it's really important to have the pricing element to be absolutely central in this, because if you have a global carbon floor or global carbon price that is agreed and floating, you have essentially it's technology neutral. So the efficiencies are directed wherever they produce the best result. I presume that's the idea. Whereas if you have a sort of rigid system where categories are kind of pre-decided in advance by a bureaucracy, whether it's the EU or anybody else, that there's a problem of sort of setting things in stone and not necessarily adopting the best technologies, either for innovation or for carbon reduction, emissions reductions. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
So the pricing mechanism indeed does give the right incentives to adopt green technologies in a way that is very robust to innovation and technological change. That is, you and I, Victor, may not be able to imagine what exactly is going to be happening in the green future, but if the price signals are correct, those who can imagine it have the incentives to make it happen.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you very much. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. We've come to the end of our time for this particular session. But Vitor and Michael, thank you both very much. And Laurence has just had to leave us at the last minute, but thank you to Laurence as well, and thank you to all the audience. And we are now going to move on very shortly to the next session. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hello, everybody, again. This is the second session of debate at this conference hosted from Paris on the carbon border adjustment mechanisms for climate. This second session, we're going to talk about a consistent approach, an approach that's consistent with the multilateral climate framework and climate needs, and also the challenges of international development. Essentially, this particular session is trying to explain how the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism plan would help meet the climate goals, but also we want to look at some of the obstacles and challenges that will be there to putting it in place. So how it will meet the objectives of the Paris Agreement, but what will be the problems in Europe, but also in less developed economies, and also perhaps some of the technical problems of design and implementation of this mechanism. For those in the audience watching who didn't attend the first session, you can ask questions by writing in the text below the video, the text box below the video, and we will be able to pick up those questions and put them to the participants in the debate. And hopefully they'll be able to answer some of your questions, or all of them, depending on how many there are. I'm going to start with Yuba Sakona, Vice Chair of the International Panel on Climate Change, and ask him, greetings, Yuba, what will it take for a carbon border adjustment mechanism of this kind to be consistent with the framework of the Paris Agreement? Is it going to be difficult? And what does coherence actually mean in real terms for implementing this kind of system, which could be rather complicated? Yuba.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation. Just a warning that related also to the issue we are discussing. I may be cut off because I'm seated in Bamako, not like than you, because I may have a power cut, I may have internet deficiency. And to a certain extent, is related to the issue we are discussing indirectly. Having said that, I cannot hear you.
Yeah, go ahead.
I can't hear you. Okay. Yeah.
I was just saying we were the ones in Paris who were cut off in the last session. So actually, you're probably got the advantage at this moment. But thank you for warning us.
I know this. Yes, this is exactly the kind of problem we are trying to solve.
Yeah.
Related to the carbon border. The point is that I fully agree with what has been clearly articulated by Minister Le Maire and Commissioner Gentiloni, and related to what is needed to be done in order to achieve the objective of the Paris Agreement. Ultimately, that is to what is needed to drastically reduce the emissions and to move toward a zero or carbon economy, as that has been articulated in the IPCC latest report. You need 4 far-reaching and unprecedented transitions for the energy sector, the land sector, including agriculture, the urban infrastructure, and industrial sector. And then this is unprecedented changes in all aspects of the economy. In order to do that, and then we need a number of instruments. And clearly, the carbon border adjustment is part of the instrument, is not the only one instrument. And the problem also is that that has to be done at global level, not only looking at a particular type of country at the global level. And in all the discussions, including the one on the carbon border adjustment, the tendency is to overlook the issue and the perspective of developing countries, particularly the least developed country, where the emissions are negligible, almost. You can, phase out all the emissions today. It not make any sense. It not make any impact. And this is not a reason in order to neglect it. the emission, because the mechanism that is under discussion may have a huge implication for those countries, and then not allowing them to move toward decarbonizing their economy for a number of reasons. And then we have experienced that with the ozone issue, because when the European Union and Europe and then the industrial world decided to phase out CFC, we have seen a proliferation of all kinds of devices that work for CFC in the African context. And then we have seen also to other aspects and environmental issues. And this is clearly something that we need to have in mind. And then we also need to have in mind that although the emissions of those countries are negligible, particularly the African context, the growth of the emission is very high in that context, and it will get higher for a number of reasons, and then we need to take that in consideration. And it is not only the immediate issue, the short-term issues we need to deal, and then we have to deal also with the longer-term issues if we really are committed to the achievement of the objective of the Paris Agreement. Looking at the African context, 80% of current electricity generation in Africa is coming from fossil. They are fossil fuel based. And it's 3% of electricity production that came from renewable, non-hydro renewable, 3% actually, currently, almost. And if you look at based on some of the finding of number of studies that emerged recently, if you look at the pipeline of projects, power sector projects in the African context, by 2030, it will be less than 10% of power generation that came from renewable, non-hydro renewable. That means there will be a lock-in effect in the African context, and then how that will be solved, because we will be this one element. Second element, the continent has to deal with and then to face the development aspiration of the continent. And by all means, it has to do that. And it may attract and then some of the polluting industry in the African context, because it's not a emitter, it may not be concerned by certain agreement on the carbon border adjustment. That is a leakage problem. It could be an area for that. And this is something you have to have in mind. And one of the most polluting industrial sector, cement. If you look at the continent, in many countries currently, they are building cement factories, while there is a wide range of alternatives. And then we have seen the increase of the temperature of the continent, and then there is a power deficiency, and then there will be a need to have more power, more electricity, and that will come from fossil fuel. At the same time, we are building more and more cement factories in that context. And then to look at also the building codes and different other aspects, that means the increase of the emission clearly in the continent. And I think all those different elements is not captured in the discussion of the carbon border adjustment, because it goes beyond the EU itself only. It goes beyond some of the high emitting countries, because we have to look at the global context to put in the context of the Paris Agreement, and then to put that in the context also of achieving the objective of sustainable development goals. And all those are interrelated. Let me stop from here, and then hoping that I will be fully part of the conversation without any power cut.
Thank you. Thank you. Just a very quick follow-up. I mean, does this mean that it is seen in some countries as a protectionist measure, the carbon border adjustment?
Clearly, there is a perception, because the problem is that it is not a clear policy and an analysis of that, but the perception from the continent and then from the poor country, from the continent, is that a kind of climate and capacity protectionism, because the continent have least capacity, financial, institution, human, and at the same time, it's been seen as a climate protectionism for a continent. And then that we need to have them on board is clearly that to bring into that conversation some of the critical elements, and then that they need for the development aspirations.
Thank you. You've outlined the problem very clearly. When you first started speaking and talked about how emissions were negligible from some developing countries, that made me think, well, in fact, this should be an advantage for those countries when faced with the carbon border adjustment mechanism, because the countries that will be penalized, or the exporters will be penalized, will be from countries with high emissions. But of course, it really depends on what products you're exporting and producing. And I imagine that is the problem, is that even though the economies are quite small in relative terms, what they export might have a high carbon content, especially if it's commodities, including oil and gas. And that presumably is the problem. And then I take your point also about the domestic energy production and domestic industry being quite carbon intensive as currently in place and as envisaged for the future. So thank you for that explanation. That's very helpful. I'm going to turn now to Mauro Petriccioni, who's Director General for Climate Action at the European Commission. I mean, maybe can you say anything that would soothe Yoba's concerns on that issue? Is the proposed carbon border adjustment mechanism, is it consistent with helping developing countries, and is it consistent, of course, also with climate goals? How do you see this developing? I mean, there's a potential conflict there, I think, in the aims of the plan.
Thanks very much. And first of all, thank you for the invitation. And a warning on my part as well, I'm not likely to suffer from power, but it doesn't mean I'm not going to get cut off. At the moment, I'm speaking from my iPad because my computer refuses to join the sound of this event. So probably without wanting to say that the problem of power in Africa isn't a gigantic issue, quite the contrary. We also managed to make our life difficult for ourselves. But let me start with a parenthesis on power in Africa, because there I want to start by saying I totally agree with what Yuba Sokuna said. It is one of the biggest problems that we face in the future, and if we don't do something serious about it soon, I think we will regret it very much. I mean, the notion of Africa powering the 600 to 800 million people who have no access to electricity with fossil fuels is mind-bogglingly frightening. If you put people in front of the choice, power or no power, they'll choose power, whatever the source. So I think there is a collective responsibility of developed nation to consider that as one of the top priorities. Close to parenthesis, because that is, well, not peripheral, but not a specific subject of our conversation. But let me say, first of all, I understand the question of perceptions, but I would invite people to look first at what we are saying in terms of what we want to achieve and why. I mean, first, this is an environmental integrity measure. We are embarking in a deep transformation inter alia of our industry. We want to start producing green steel. We will pay for it, as we have paid for the development of renewables, which we have subsidized heavily for decades, with the rest of the world happily thinking that we were stark raving mad. And that technology is available to everybody, and it's one of the cheapest forms of energy if you look at operating costs. What we can't afford is to see our industry disappear because we are, for a time, increasing their costs beyond those of their competitors, because their competitors are based in countries that don't make the same choices we are making in terms of climate emission. That is the objective. And of course, you hear a debate, you hear different voices in the debate. You hear people who look about their trade competitiveness situation. You look at people who You hear people talk about how to use the income of such a measure. But okay, this is a legitimate debate. But this is not the kind of proposal that you will see from the European Commission. And I'm absolutely convinced that there's no consensus in Europe to adopt a proposal which does not have environmental integrity at its core. Now, developing countries, it might happen, but we're very likely to start with a few sectors, a few products. So for each country will depend on whether they are a serious exporter to Europe of that product. It depends on how that product is made. But it also depends on what is the policy of a country to fight climate action. And policies aren't all the same, and they don't all need to be equal. The policy on climate change that one expects from an African country isn't the policy one expects from Europe or the United States. So it is going to be extremely difficult to move into the debate on when is this measure really to be applied and when it is not. We have no illusion that it's going to be a very controversial and very unpleasant discussion. But we are on record and saying that our objective is not to apply the measure. Our objective is to make sure that if we pursue the greening of industrial productions, we don't lose our industry in the process. If our partners to export to Europe those products can show us through a dialogue, because there's no other way, that their level of ambition is in the same league, then by definition, their products bear a similar burden. And the issue of undue competition does not arise. Now, this is a simple, perhaps simplistic explanation, I accept that, but we will open this debate with all our partners, and we've already started in many ways. Then, where will we start from to see whether this actually works and whether it does what we hope it does without disrupting our trade patterns? Don't forget, Europe is the biggest trader in the world, and trade is fundamental for Europe. You know, yes, there have always been Europeans who advocate protectionism, but they never won the day because Europe can't survive without trade. And we're the biggest importer of products from developing countries. So I'm not saying there's nothing to worry about, but the intention and the design is not to block things at the border. The willingness to open a dialogue based on what are we doing to stop climate and not on industrial or trade considerations is there. So the elements for having a rational discussion on how we determine whether we should apply a measure or not, and hopefully determine that we don't need to, are there. On the other hand, we are trying to create a model, a working model of an economy that's developed, competitive, modern, that leads you to a prosperous society and at net zero emissions. If our producers have to compete with people who deliberately and happily continue to use fossil fuels for their production, and we have to lose chunks of our industry in the process, well, not only we will fail, but our people will stop us. And we can't afford to risk that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I note you saying you have no illusions it's going to be a very controversial and unpleasant discussion. I mean, in practical terms, isn't it going to be imports from China, East Asia, and possibly the United States that are really going to be the ones that are most affected by the sort of price equalization measures that will be in place?
It depends. It depends on what they do. The United States under Trump, very likely. The United States under President Biden, we may have a very different configuration. The president has been saying already that the US wants to achieve climate neutrality by 2050. It's our same goal. They've been in office for a few months, and already we see a flourishing of initiative. We're waiting to see how the US translates its objective in domestic policies. They have a huge amount of catch up to do. At the same time, large parts of the US never stopped working in that direction. There are states whose economy has been decarbonizing. There are companies who have been working with us and with others to decarbonize. So I think one can hope and assume that the US will go faster than if it were starting from scratch. So it depends. It depends on all that. China's in the middle of the river. China's announced a 2060 zero emission goal, which for a developing country like China, because China it's a hybrid. There's a developed China, there is a developing China, and there's an underdeveloped China, is an appropriate date. Do they have the right policies? Not yet. But they've announced that goal a few months ago. But there is a debate in Beijing. We're worried about it. I don't want to sound optimistic, but I think there's a debate in Beijing. If that debate doesn't go wrong, China will have the right policies. We'll see China peaking. We'll see emissions going down, and then it's a different story. The China we have today, yes, that's a problem for us because the carbon content of Chinese products is extremely high. But the whole objective of this is to start the discussion on what are we doing in relation to the Paris Agreement goals, and are we going far enough, fast enough, and are we doing the right thing? There are reasons for concerns, many. There are some reasons for optimism.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that explanation. I'm going to turn now to Timothy Gore, Head of Program for Low Carbon and the Circular Economy at the Institute for European Environmental Policy. Perhaps you can expand a little bit on Yuba's concerns about how developing countries are going to be affected by this. And particularly, I was curious about his point about energy production, including future energy production. I mean, maybe we've all been sort of slightly bamboozled by the vision of kind of enormous solar farms in North Africa that are going to power Europe. I mean, is this really something that's a long way off reality, or is there actually sort of some quite aggressive development of renewable energies? I mean, I was very struck. I used to live in India quite recently, and while I was there was a massive rollout of solar power stations, which are essentially selling power at or below the grid price, which was a novelty then, because a few years earlier the price of solar photovoltaic energy had been 10 times the grid price in countries like India or indeed in Spain. So yeah, perhaps just tell us a little bit about how you see things on the energy front, but also on the potential pitfalls for developing countries of this European proposal. Timothy, thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Well, thanks first of all for the invitation, and good to be with you all. And I suppose I just wanted to pick up on something that Mauro just said, which is that the European Commission, the European Union here wants to start a conversation, and that's very welcome because I think to date there's been very little conversation with developing countries about this proposal. I mean, there's really been a notable lack, I would say, of adequate diplomatic outreach, particularly to the most vulnerable countries. So, I mean, in my engagements that I've had with, for example, the Least Developed Countries Group, or with the Climate Vulnerable Forum, or the Vulnerable 20 group of countries, just as examples, there's currently been no formal, substantive diplomatic outreach, and that really needs to change because in the absence of that, and given that there is a certain ambiguity, I would say, about the EU's narrative about this measure, what it's for, that's a breeding ground for suspicion, for mistrust, and as you said at the beginning, as Yuba noted, many developing countries will see this essentially as a protectionist measure if it's not better understood, and that makes it appear as though it's something coercive and it's not aligned with the principles of common but differentiated responsibilities in the UN climate regime. So embracing that dialogue, going about it concertedly in the next months before the proposal comes out in June is really critical to try and explain better. And I think, what we've already heard today from Mauro goes a long way towards that. If you give a message that says, actually, our intention here is not even to apply this thing, that's very different to sending a message that says, oh, we're going to slap a tariff on your imports because you're not doing enough to reduce your emissions at home. So, clarifying this narrative and embracing dialogue and outreach is really critical. And I think for many developing countries will be concerned about how that perception and how that mistrust may have implications for the multilateral climate regime this year and could undermine the prospects of a stronger agreement. And that's a concern to all developing countries because this is a top priority, obviously. But then, as you've been saying, as you've been discussing, there are certain developing countries that will be particularly impacted by this measure. And it's not just the big emerging economies, the kinds that you suggested. And in fact, they're pretty able to fight their corner. They've been pretty vocal in the debate. We've heard quite a lot about their concerns. But really, there are a number of much smaller, much poorer, and highly climate vulnerable countries that are exposed here. So it's as Mauro was suggesting, it depends on the scope of the measure, which products are going to be included. And it depends, of course, on the capacity of those countries, both technically to comply with the measure, so to assess the carbon content of their exports, but also their capacity to transition in order to maintain their international competitiveness. So there are countries like Mozambique, which is the least developed country. It's highly dependent on exports of energy-intensive goods to the EU. They've got lots of mineral resources. It's exports like aluminium. They will be they're clearly highly exposed to this measure. All right, actually Mozambique has quite a low carbon intensity of its economy, but as it grows, as it develops, the question is, can it maintain that low carbon intensity? And it will need financial support in order to do that. So it can't just be assumed. We need to build this in a cooperative way such that Mozambique can feel they can maintain their international competitiveness as they grow their economy. And there are other countries depending on the scope. And I think one of the concerns here as well is that there is an ambiguity in the EU narrative about just how broad this thing is going to go. You've heard a lot today about saying, well, we're going to start with a small list, but progressively expand it over time. And I think there's a real difference here. If you're a vulnerable country, if you're a small developing country, it's one thing if you're told we're just looking here at a subset of highly trade exposed, energy intensive industries, then you know whether or not you're going to be affected or how likely you are to be affected. But if the impression is that this is going to expand over time to include everything, then countries like Bangladesh that have huge exports of textiles to the European Union, they may be implicated in years to come. Countries like Morocco, huge exports to the European Union. They're about 20% of their GDP dependent on exports to the EU. So the broader that you go, or the broader you create the impression that you will go, the more countries that are going to be affected, the more the political challenges, the more the technical challenges, and of course then the more political energy that is needed to address those, to engage with countries. So I would say, the best thing here is to keep it much narrower, but to prioritize the engagement with developing countries, starting with the least developed countries, the Vulnerable 20, the Climate Vulnerable Forum, the SIDS groupings that already exist, both in their trade formations and in their climate formations, and to do that starting before the proposal comes out.
Thanks. And actually, this ties in quite nicely to a question from someone in the audience. It's from a journalist, actually, from Paulo Tamar of Politico. And the question is for Mauro. And it goes as follows. If least developed countries are to be exempted from the carbon border adjustment mechanisms, how to avoid turning them into an environmental dump for all the polluting production of the world? So, this is essentially the problem, right? If you don't make it universal, then you don't solve the problem you're trying to solve. Mauro, what do you say to that?
Well, okay. First of all, I think it would be helpful if one started from the things that we have been saying. We haven't said everything for the very simple reason that today I haven't a clue what this proposal is going to look like. We've just finished the impact assessment. It hasn't been reviewed by an independent regulatory scrutiny board.
So it's not been finalized yet.
My colleagues are just beginning to write the options for the legislation. So, there is a limit to how much you can tell people, don't worry, this is not going to happen because that's not what our proposal looks like. I don't know. Secondly, the president and the vice president have been on record several times saying literally the purpose is not to apply this measure, is to create a condition why this measure should not be applicable. Today, the conditions are there. Tomorrow, we'd like those conditions to go away. So we are on record saying that at the highest level. Small developing countries, more than vulnerable. First of all, objectively, it isn't likely that small and vulnerable developing countries produce the kind of product which we're going to green at this stage of our policies. Okay? I don't see a lot of steel coming from small and vulnerable developing countries. Nor do we produce aluminium. We're not going to create a green aluminium filière of minerals in Europe because we don't have those minerals. We would like to see the minerals we import produced with less carbon, but that's another story. You cannot address that with a border measure. That's a different story and a different set of policies. Conversely, steel produced with coal will be an issue, as it has been an issue at our border to have cement displacing and closing down plants in Europe because the plants in Europe pay the carbon price and their competitors across the border didn't. As it has been a problem to see coal-fired power exported from Morocco across the strait to Spain at a time when Spain was closing coal mines and losing jobs, and setting out a massive compensation scheme for people who were losing their jobs. Look at things from both directions. The least developing countries option, let's exclude them because they don't matter, they are not part of the problem. It's one of the things we're discussing. Should we do it? Yes, the question that Paola asked is a pertinent one. Not likely to happen massively because this threat has been waived on for all sorts of reasons for the past few decades. I spent 30 years doing trade policy and I've never seen that actually happen. And if it had happened, maybe we would have seen some more development in a number of countries. But it is one of the issues we'll have to look at. How do we avoid that risk? At the same time, if it is not very rational, if you like, to move production massively towards countries that don't have the infrastructure, only to avoid a border measure. It doesn't usually happen. What is rational is to invest in new locations, in green production, because you're starting from scratch, maybe in locations that have greater potential, for instance, for green electricity, and then use them as a basis to get around the border measure. Well, that's the kind of circumvention we would love to see. If having a border measure encourages better investment in poorer countries to export cleaner products to Europe, that would be absolutely fantastic.
Yuba, are you reassured by what Mauro Pietrociani has been saying? How do you see this? I think you might be on mute. I'm not sure.
Not at all, because as I indicated, because clearly I said that today, 80% of electricity generated in Africa is coming from fossil. All the projects that need to be implemented for power generation by 2030, it's only will be less than 10% from the renewables, despite the big decrease of renewable, the prices, and then despite also that the decrease of the storage system we are not seeing the renewable taking off. Because the continent, the issue, it is not a reduction of emission, is to build the system. And that is completely a new system because the infrastructure needs to be built. It is not to retrofit, it is not to adjust, it's to build new systems. And then the new systems is based on the old technology. This one element. Second element, that is related to the continent may face the stranded assets because they need to invest in energy for their development. What option they do have? There's no single other option than the fossil. Currently, if they need to industrialize or their industrialization will be forklift. Is that an option we have to face, the forklift of the industrialization of the continent? Second element, most of the countries are team indicated are exporting only one or two natural resources, not more than that. A large of them are exporting oil, they're exporting natural gas. And then the continent also is a place where every year you have a new discovery of oil and gas. And there is a big need of fueling their economy, their development. And then that need to be at the center of the discussion. And then we cannot isolate the carbon border adjustment to discuss it without putting in the context of the broader issues of the achieving the objective of the Paris Agreement and achieving the objective of sustainable development. And those are, but I have not seen those conversations happening.
Yeah, but there's a very relevant question here from one of the audience, Juliet Segura, and basically asking should least developed countries be exempted from this mechanism, as has been posted as a possibility?
As I indicated, this exemption of them is not an option, and then this is delaying the a longer problem. And then they are at the best situation because they are benefiting for the later later come advantage. Because the system needs to be built, it can be built differently. As I indicated, 4 critical transition that is needed in order to decarbonize the economy. The energy system, we need to build the energy system. It can start away from the renewables. So the transport, the infrastructure, and all those different aspects can be done completely differently. And then it can be applied to them provided we consider those different elements, and then there is a mechanism also that will take care of that.
There's another question on this topic, basically saying, if a country like, in this case, Morocco, this is a question from Said Moulin, and a question for you. If Morocco puts in place or has put in place a decarbonization strategy which requires financial support, how should these decarbonization policies be supported, be accompanied by governments or international organizations, I guess? So the question is, isn't there a possibility that developing countries could themselves try to decarbonize their economies in any case, because it's going to be in their interest, and in many cases it's cheaper? The development of solar power in India was simply because it was more economical, not because it was a demand of the climate lobby.
The problem is that there is all option for that, but concretely, in many of those countries, you have no choice. You cannot do it. I told you that I may have a power cut, but I have backup system. Unfortunately, my backup system is diesel. It is not solar because technically it's not possible, and it's difficult to find people who can, put that in place. Clearly, the problem is that it can be done, but we need to look at all those different instruments at the global level, and then not picking individual countries, because Morocco is related, and the economy of Morocco is related to the economy of many of the sub-Saharan African countries. And then they are exporting a lot of goods and products here in Mali, in Bamako, in Mali, and then they are connected, and then we need to look at the broader and the global level, and then having in mind the achievement of the Paris Agreement objective, and then the SDGs.
Thank you very much. We're running out of time for this session. There's another question which is directed to Tim Gore, but I think Mauro may also have a word. Maybe you could both briefly comment on this, because it has been an issue that you've discussed. Essentially, the question is from Hassan Aguzul, and it says, what place is given to governments, private sector and civil society among the EU's neighbours, particularly in the south, again, Morocco, one of the near neighbours, in the design or the talks about the design of this carbon border adjustment mechanism to make the transition fair. So, I mean, I think more or less Tim has said that there hasn't been enough discussion, and Mauro says it's all still under debate. But maybe you could just briefly summarise your response to that question, and then we'll have to end the session. Maybe start with Tim.
I was going to say that Mauro can have the last word, but no, I think one of the key questions here is about the use of revenues, which has come up, and you know, it's another example where there are mixed messages. I mean, I take Mauro's point that sometimes the EU's been very clear about the purpose of this mechanism, but sometimes you get contradictory messages as well from other parts of the institution, even if you look at the European Parliament's report, etc. And if you're in developing countries, you don't know exactly which of these different messages to look at. So on the use of revenues, on the one hand, the EU has signalled this is going to be a source of own revenues for us to help us to repay the debts we've incurred to finance the recovery from the COVID-19 crisis. On the other hand, you hear references here and there from people like Mauro saying, well, actually, you know, we could look at directing some of this to developing countries to help them to modernize their supply chains. So that's a critical question. And I would just like to finish really by stressing that, you know, particularly in the Vulnerable 20 group, for example, they are putting forward what they call climate prosperity plans. They're not trying to hide here or to remain as sort of laggards or victims. Actually, they want to modernize their supply chains so that they can maintain their international competitiveness in this kind of new regime. But they will need support, whether that's technical support, intellectual property transfers, other types of capacity building, as well as financial support. And the revenues should be seen and understood in that context. And I really think it's time that the EU quietly drops the idea that they will use this to repay their debts and just embraces the fact it's not that a huge amount of money anyway, but it would be better spent directed to developing countries to support them in this transition. In that way, this becomes a cooperative measure, it becomes a search for collective solutions. And I think that's the spirit in which, you know, it might have a better chance of success.
Mauro, maybe you could finish off by telling us whether the revenue raising is a key part of it, or whether that's not necessarily essential.
Okay, look, I mean, first of all, on the question of openness, transparency, consultation, we've just finished an open consultation with 38 foreign countries contributing to it. And we are mandated to look at each and every... Why do our legislation take so long? We've had thousands, if not tens of thousands of contribution, and we are running about 10 or 12 of these consultations at the same time. Some of them with 70, 80,000 replies. Now, many of them are identical, grant you, but on average, we get between 800 and 3,000 substantive replies that somebody's got to go through, understand, and make sure that we have a meaningful reply. Maybe people don't like the reply, but, you know, we are taking this seriously. So, yes, there is space for people to be heard wherever they are and whoever they are. Secondly, the confusing signals. Well, you can't have a democratic debate and have everything perfectly ordered. The official position of the European Commission will appear on the 30th of June when a proposal is on the table. The official position of the European Union will appear when our Council and Parliament have approved the legislation or not. In the meantime, we have a debate. People can say anything. They can even talk rubbish if they want to. It's their God-given right. A measure which is capable of producing revenue is bound to create a debate about how the revenue is going to be spent. Thank God for that. I mean, would you want governments to enact measures that produce revenue without knowing where the hell that money goes, and without having people having the ability to express themselves about how that money should be spent? And it's not just that tiny bit of revenue. The debate is about the entirety of the revenue we're generating. The debate is about how we spend Next Generation EU. The debate is how we spend the over 1 trillion of our budget, and how we go for a Team Europe approach with the money member states are spending, which is much bigger. And I have to say, on the question of energy, which remains crucial, I'm not reassured this time. Because I'm sorry, Africa is capable of greening its electricity supply. Look at Kenya, look at Ethiopia. I've just finished hearing in the Ministerial Climate Action that we co-host with China and Canada, the South African minister talking about closing down and repurposing coal power station and moving to renewable. South Africa, who has 1 million people employed in the coal sector, and has a gigantic problem with just transition that we need to help them with. So it can be done. It will not be done because somebody decrees it. It will be done because we, developed nations, do our part, and because there will be investment opportunities, and it will not be done tomorrow.
Thank you.
That Mozambique has discovered gas. Well, nobody expects Mozambique to be a zero emission in 2050. But between now and 2060, 2070, for a country like Mozambique, there is a lot of time to plan a transition, to benefit from a resource, and then phase it out. As we are phasing out fossil fuels, we're not going to get rid of them tomorrow. We've given ourselves 30 years for that phase out.
And
the same can be done elsewhere.
And the main thing is that your carbon border adjustment mechanism is not yet set in stone and will not even come into force until 2023 at the earliest, right?
Put it this way, if we enact it and it's enough to prompt a discussion about the collective efforts to decarbonize, and we never apply, you'll never have a happier bunch of people than in the Commission.
Thank you very much to all of you. Thanks to Yuba in Bamako, Mauro, I guess in Brussels, are you, Mauro? And,
yep.
And Timothy in London or in Brussels?
Stockholm.
Stockholm, okay. Well, thank you to all of you for joining us, and we'll move on now to the next session, but thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Good afternoon, everybody, again. Thank you very much, and welcome again to this Carbon Border Adjustment for Climate conference. This is our third session, and this one is really about how the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism must and can be consistent with WTO rules. So potentially a bit technical, but obviously very important for it to be accepted, if it is to be accepted at all internationally. Just a reminder that if you want to pose a question, you can write in the text box below the video, and we will pick that up and hopefully put it to the participants we have here today for the next 40 minutes or so. I'm going to start with Bernd Lange, who's a member of the European Parliament and the chair for the Parliament on international trade. I think I saw you talking today about China. I don't think that was a trade issue, but greetings, Bernd. Yeah, I mean, maybe you can just start by telling us how, why is compatibility with WTO rules so important, and how does this affect or influence the type of mechanism that is being envisaged by the EU at the moment, although we know it's not completely final yet. So Bernd, perhaps you could introduce the subject in that way.
Thanks a lot, and thanks a lot for the invitation. And unfortunately, I have to leave the session a little bit earlier because of the China development in the last days, and it's really a terrible situation. But this has also some link to your question, because I'm totally convinced that we have to create a system which is WTO compatible and which will not lead to any trade war. And therefore, indeed, as several participants said today, the devil is in the detail, and we should really look on the detail for such an instrument. And we did it in my committee quite closely, and we are convinced that we have to make clear that this instrument is not an instrument for getting own resources or for really protect the domestic industry. It is an instrument which should lead to a reduction of CO2 domestically, but also on the other side of the border. So there will be no discrimination, and I think this is crucial for the development of such an instrument. So you know the WTO rules, Article 2 and 3, and we should really be in line with these rules. Otherwise, we will have a penal case immediately. And this should be not the result of all the work we had done so far. So it should be really an environmental tool under Article 20, I'm sure. And this is a possibility to bring acceptance in such an instrument. And to make clear that this is not a discriminatory instrument, we have also to make clear that if there is a product or production process is more CO2 efficient than the domestic one, that this would lead to benefit to the producer outside the European Union. This has to be also crystal clear. Normally we are thinking that only we in the European Union are producing CO2 efficiently, but this is of course not all the time the case, and therefore there should be also some benefits for companies from outside the European Union. And this leads to a further detailed question. What is the focus point of such a measure? Is it a product? I don't think so. It is not possible to define a footprint, a CO2 footprint for each product we are trading with. And you can't really make a focus point for, let's say, a country or such, because this is really not flexible and not reflecting the specific necessities of developing countries. So I think the only way is to look on the production process. And we have some international benchmarks for production process in energy-intensive industries, like steel, like cement. And due to the figures, which industrial production is really relevant for CO2 and even for the carbon leakage linked to our first session, I think these energy-intensive productions are relevant, and we should really focus on this benchmark we have so far. So I guess this CBAM will focus on these sectors. And then, should it be a tax or should it be some other kind of revenue? Due to the internal situation in the legislation inside the European Union, I'm quite sure that this is not a tax. A tax has also some implication for WTO on Article 3 of the GATT. And certainly it will be not so easy to get a tax through inside the European Union because you need unanimity in the Council, and this will, I guess, not happen. So therefore, I think based on the idea that it's an environmental measure under Article 20, then of course this has to be based on another article inside the internal European legislation, and this will lead also to qualified majority in the Council and the normal legislative procedure between Parliament and Council. And this would really be focused on a concrete production process. And this also gives more flexibility. During the last session, it was quite clear that we have to respect the developing countries and the interest in specific production processes and the transformation in this process. And therefore, we have to give also the flexibility to companies in this country. And this is possible with this model. So I think this will be the direction the European Parliament will argue for in the future.
Thank you. Just in case you have to run off, I want to ask a question to you right away, a political question, really. You know, John Kerry has been very lukewarm about this proposal in an interview with the FT the other day. Mr. Cormann, the incoming Secretary General of the OECD, also in an interview in the Financial Times today, was very negative about it. Although he was in favor of international agreements on taxing the big companies, he was much less favorable about the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism. He essentially poured cold water on it. We've heard developing countries express grave concerns. Is it possible that China, the US, and other opponents will just make sure that this scheme is killed before it even sees the light of day? Or are you confident that the EU can actually push this over the line?
Yeah, of course. Therefore, I think we have to be really careful and not overload the instrument. So it has to be totally 100% certain WTO compatible. And of course, we have to also have a dialogue with the main trading partners as US and China, no doubt about. So the internal question, the WTO compatibility, the dialogue with the trading partners, and of course, the effect, if it's really useful to have an instrument for reducing CO2. These 4 questions are the key questions. I personally had some dialogue with some forces inside the United States. Of course, there are now opportunities, but you're quite right. Mr. Kerry was quite reluctant. And therefore, we have to be very clear that this is not a harm of specific companies specific companies in the United States, and the fear is really there, and so dialogue is necessary.
Thank you. I'm going to turn now to Vangelis Vitalis. Are you in New Zealand? What time of day is it where you are?
Yes, I am. Good morning. It's what is it? It's 10 to 6 in the morning.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. It's extremely heroic of you. I thought it might be very early in the morning there. I remember being told by my news desk just to pop down to Auckland from Hong Kong, because it was all in Asia, you know, and there was an election going on. And I said, well, it is a 13-hour flight. You do realize that? And they said, no, it can't be. It's all in Asia Pacific. But anyway, so I feel your pain. Thank you very much for joining us. Mr. Vitalis is the Deputy Secretary for Trade and the Economy of the New Zealand Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. I mean, yeah, maybe just tell us, how does it seem from New Zealand? I mean, you know, you're a big trading partner with the EU. How might it affect you, and what input are you trying to have to make sure that it fits your needs in New Zealand?
So, look, thank you very much. So what I thought I'd do is, to answer your question, sort of step back a little bit and think a little bit about the context, and in particular the way in which trade policy should be contributing to climate change, because this is just one other tool in the toolbox. And I want to speak sort of in 3 parts, sort of sketch some of the context, talk a little bit about some of the challenges and risks. And it was quite interesting to listen to the previous session, which I think flagged up some of those risks. And I'm certainly looking forward to Professor Porterfield's comments as well. Then I want to suggest some guiding principles that that we would certainly be wanting to see enacted in this process, and then make some concluding observations. But my main observation is, for this to work, not only does it need to be WTO compatible, but I do strongly recommend that the time is taken to get this right, to do it right, because there are a whole range, as I touch on in my risks, a whole range of things out there that that do worry us, that if this is done too quickly or without due regard to WTO rules and so on, that puts additional pressure on what is a very fragile rules-based trading system at present. So look, let me start first with the most obvious point, which is, of course, I think we all share the objective that we do need to do something about climate change. We clearly do need to reduce CO2 emissions. That's clear, and COVID has simply exacerbated, I think, that tension and the need to not just build back better, but build back greener. And clearly, we all are committed to the Paris Agreement, and we do need to see how that gets meaningfully implemented. And then that raises the question, how does trade contribute? There are a number of ways that trade policy contribute. There's unilateral trade policies, reform of environmentally harmful subsidies unilaterally, regulations that drive domestic standards, and of course, green procurement process. So these are things that economies can do themselves. Then there's the multilateral process at the World Trade Organization. And I think we need to be honest here about the fact that actually the agenda in Geneva at the WTO is actually a disappointingly narrow one. It's focused on environmental goods and services and the relationship between the World Trade Organization and multilateral environmental agreements. Now, that is a narrow agenda. It's the classical trade agenda, but it's a narrow one. Then I think we look at free trade agreements, and yes, New Zealand is in the process of negotiating. It's very nice to see you, Helanga. We are in the process of course, negotiating a free trade agreement with Europe, and we do have a genuine interest here to see how a free trade agreement can contribute. And so again, we have the classical elements, environmental goods and services, green procurement, and then of course we need to think about how we use the Trade and Sustainable Development chapter to articulate our shared commitment, New Zealand's and the EU's, EU and other partners, to the Paris Agreement and its effective implementation. So we have unilateral, we have multilateral, we have our bilateral free trade agreements, we have the institutional instruments that we all work in together. APEC, New Zealand is chairing APEC this year, and of course we want APEC to contribute to the climate challenge, including, for example, by updating, it's often a little known fact that the only international organization in the world that has an agreed list of environmental goods is in fact APEC. It's got 54 products identified in 2012. No other institution has that, despite the fact that the World Trade Organization launched the negotiation on environmental goods in 2001. So there's APEC, there's the OECD, there's these international institutions that need to help us prepare and develop the kinds of tools we need. And then finally, and this is where we come to the CBAM, there are plurilateral approaches, but I did want to also flag there are other plurilateral approaches out there as well. The New Zealand Prime Minister launched the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability 18 months ago, together with Norway, Switzerland, Iceland, Fiji, and Costa Rica. Very significantly, I think this was an attempt by a small group of like-minded, ambitious economies to say, how do we use trade rules to reform subsidies of fossil fuels? So this is an attempt to say, we know that the G20 has been saying for the last 12 years they want to reform fossil fuel subsidies. How would you do that if you were going to use a trade agreement? How would you drive that reform in the same way we drove agricultural reform? Still on the plurilateral, then of course there is the CBAM. Now I have deliberately said that it needs to be plurilateral because I am very convinced that the only way to make this work internationally is for it to be a plurilateral mechanism, not a unilateral measure. That brings me to the question of why CBAM, and Helanga has already touched on that. There are essentially three reasons. I think we all share that. It's the wish to reduce CO2, so to really implement Paris. Second, of course, it's the carbon leakage competitiveness concern, something we certainly share a concern about. And let's be frank too, the third reason is, of course, to leverage actual change. Now, this is where I find myself, when I reflect on the CBAM, torn between two elements. First, as an economist, I can certainly see the argument for this tool. It is an efficient way to try to drive change. On the other hand, though, for the last 20 years, I've been working in the trade field. So, of course, as a trade guy, I certainly look at this and I think to myself, well, there are some risks here, and that's what I want to now touch on. The risks are real, and the risks are often perception risks. And I think this is one of the big things that we do need to work together on to manage down that perception. The first perception is that this is another protectionist measure. Now, fair or not, that is kind of a perception, and you heard that very clearly, I think, in session 2. Second big risk, I think, is the reaction of developing countries and least developed countries. And again, we heard some of that in session 2. The fear that I have is the risk of retaliation, and you mentioned that also, Helanga, in your presentation. I think the real risk here is that we jeopardize what is potentially a very effective tool by its poor design. So a poorly designed measure that exposes you to a tit-for-tat retaliation, a trade war, God forbid, it's the last thing, frankly, we need, would really be damaging not just to this instrument, but actually to the trade rules, the rules-based trading system on which we all rely. I think underlining some of that is also the question of how do you use the tariff revenue? Clearly, it would help if you were to say, we're going to use this tariff revenue to mitigate climate change either domestically or to mitigate climate change in other economies. So we're going to use the revenue for a climate change purpose. I think that does help. But my real fear is the design of a scheme that's genuinely WTO compatible. And there, I think the risk is that almost immediately this scheme is implemented, you find yourself in court in Geneva. And my fear here, frankly, is that there is no good outcome from a panel. On the one hand, if there is a ruling against the CBAM, the social license for trade policy, I think, in the environment community is fatally damaged. I think, to put it bluntly, the concern would be that trade rules then trump the environment, that this would be a very damaging perception, again, for what is a very fragile system in place at present. And I think the other risk is designing a scheme that can effectively capture the thought that one size does not fit all. So I think it is very sensible that the focus at the moment is on steel and aluminium, where you do have robust time series for the data sets. You can actually design something from then. I think once it spreads beyond those two core industries, potentially chemicals is another, I think your challenges become greater. And this brings me back to my point about the importance of ensuring the due diligence. That brings me to the last point that I want to make, which is the guiding principles. I think it is really important, and from our perspective, I've identified 8 guiding principles. One is WTO compatibility. Second is necessity. So to be able to demonstrate that there is a necessity for this. Third, there needs to be proportionality. So this is actually a very careful calibration that's required, that the measure, that the level of the tariff genuinely reflects in a proportionate way the impact that you're trying to mitigate. Fourth, non-discriminatory. Fifth, transparency. Sixth, predictability. Seventh, the least trade restrictive measure. And eighth, active consultation. And I think I heard Mauro earlier speak about this, and I think that's a fair comment. Yes, there has been consultation, but frankly, there needs to be more. And I know that many economies, and certainly New Zealand, is a very willing partner in that consultation process. Yes, we have concerns. Yes, we are anxious. But at the same time, we do understand the driver for this. My concluding thought then is trade policy clearly should contribute to this, this climate change mitigation challenge we all face. Others are using trade policy in new and interesting ways. I like to think that New Zealand is trying to do that with its agreement on climate change, trade and sustainability. And we want to be a good partner because we do share the objective of making sure that the Paris Agreement really can fulfill its commitments. So CBAM is not a new idea, but it is an interesting additional element in our toolbox. But my fourth concluding observation is it's not straightforward to implement. It needs to be WTO compatible. I've provided some guidelines that from our perspective, we would want to test against what the outcome looks like. Above all, I think we have a shared interest in sustaining the rules-based system and its fragility. That's what worries me, and the risks that I see from counter tit-for-tat retaliation and a spiraling trade war, that really does worry me. One size does not fit all. I think that's a really important principle that does need to be kind of kept in here. But look, above all, and I'm very conscious I've spoken over the time, but above all, my main point is it is so crucial. I think we have a shared interest in this, that the Commission takes the time to do this right and do the due diligence, and that I firmly believe is in our shared interests that we get it right the first time, that it is done right, so that these risks and challenges that I've touched on can be mitigated as far as possible.
Thank you very much. That's really interesting. I mean, essentially, it's better to design it well first than have to have a situation where it gets challenged in the WTO by you or anybody else. Yeah. So this is exactly the moment we want to turn to Matthew Porterfield, who's been waiting very patiently. Deputy Director and Adjunct Professor at the Harrison Institute for Public Law of Georgetown University Law Center, who I think is hopefully going to be able to tell us what exactly are the criteria that should be met or need to be met for WTO compatibility of this kind of measure that is being proposed by the EU. Matthew.
Great, thank you very much. I will attempt to give a broad overview of the relevant WTO rules and how they might apply to the proposed carbon border adjustment mechanism. I'd just like to start by endorsing some of the suggestions you just heard for the need for consultation beforehand. And I'll conclude with some suggestions on what that might look like, particularly with regard to issues where there may be some common ground with the United States. But
Oops, I think we've just lost your sound there. You're coming back.
Am I coming back? Can you hear
Matthew,
me?
you're back. Yes, sorry. We missed just the very beginning of what you said. Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I was saying that the WTO rules are complicated. In general, trying to predict the outcome of future disputes of programs that haven't yet been designed is challenging. But I would stress that even though the perception may be that the problem's legal at this point, the solution will likely be diplomatic. So I think there's a real need for further discussions. So broadly, what are border adjustments? Border tax adjustment in general refers to the practice of applying certain types of domestic taxes on products, imports, and in some instances, rebating those taxes on exports, following what's called the destination principle, pursuant to which products are taxed where they're consumed, not where they're produced. Border adjustments have been used for hundreds of years. The basic rationale was articulated by David Ricardo about 200 years ago. And they are widely used by countries that impose consumption taxes, like value-added taxes, for instance, which is most of the countries in the world with the conspicuous exception of the United States. They're generally considered to be non or minimally trade distorting because products are subject to the same tax burden regardless where they're produced. Carbon border adjustments would simply be the application of this approach to carbon pricing programs like the EU's emissions trading system, which would, as has been discussed, prevent the energy intensive industries from shifting to jurisdictions without comparable carbon pricing, which would result in the loss of industrial output, associated job loss, and the leakage of greenhouse emissions that would occur when the fossil fuels are still combusted in the production process in other countries. The relevant rules of the World Trade Organization regarding border tax adjustments are contained primarily for import adjustments under the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and for exports under the WTO's Subsidies Agreement. And because in general border adjustments are considered to be non-trade distorting, the rules are drafted to accommodate them, and they generally permit border tax adjustments so long as they are applied with respect to what are called indirect taxes, which are generally consumption taxes. Value-added taxes can be border adjusted. Corporate income taxes cannot be border adjusted. Those are direct taxes, not subject to adjustment. And also the border adjustments must be applied at a rate that is not in excess of the taxes imposed on like domestic products, or in the case of exports, they can't be rebated beyond the rate imposed on domestically consumed like products. So the idea is to maintain the parallelism of tax treatment of the products regardless of where they're produced and to put the burden at the point of consumption. Significantly, border adjustments are permitted not only for taxes imposed on imported and exported products themselves, but also for taxes imposed at earlier stages in the production process, including on energy inputs. And there was actually a fairly significant fight over this during the Uruguay round negotiations. Some countries that used different forms of multi-stage taxes complained that the rules favored other forms of taxation, and the rules were adjusted to make it explicit that taxes on the production process, including energy inputs, were adjustable. Even if, as was suggested earlier, even if there was some sort of prima facie violation of the GATT, a carbon border adjustment could be permissible under the environmental exception provisions of Article 20 of the GATT. And it seems like that is the narrow pathway that the EU is aiming for. However, if, as seems likely, the EU's CBAM takes the form of a requirement for importers to purchase allowances under the ETS or from a separate pool of allowances, it would present several challenges in complying with the relevant rules. The ETS would probably be considered to be a regulatory program rather than a tax, and therefore would not be considered adjustable under the GATT. It would need to be excused under the environment. Compliance with Article 20 is possible, but let's see, is my sound still there? Yeah. The Article 20 involves about a half dozen or so separate legal standards that you have to navigate, and in practice, it's been fairly difficult to satisfy when it's been challenged in WTO dispute settlement proceedings. In addition, as the price increases under the ETS, there will probably be more pressure from some of your energy intensive industries to also extend the border adjustments to exports to preserve their share of global markets. Border adjustments on exports of the ETS could be considered export subsidies under the WTO subsidies agreement. And it is not clear whether or not the environmental exceptions contained under Article 20 would extend to the subsidies agreement. I think the conventional wisdom on that used to be that Article 20 doesn't apply to the subsidies agreement. I think there's been some softening in that position, so I wouldn't rule that out altogether. It's also, I think, significant. It's not clear at this point whether or not the CBAM will replace the current system of free allowances, or as some constituencies have been pushing for, it will be added on top of that system. If there's essentially double protection for European industries, both through the award of free allowances and through a border adjustment, that would almost certainly be found to violate the relevant disciplines. And I think it's important to note that even without a new border adjustment mechanism, the ETS is likely to become a source of trade tensions. The US Commerce Department in December concluded that a part of the free allowance program under the ETS constitutes countervailable subsidies. And I would anticipate that there will be similar challenges to the system of free allowances under the subsidies agreement. And this gets us back to where I started, which is that I think there is a need for more international dialogue, both on the CBAM, but also on climate and trade more generally, given that any aggressive approach to climate policy that tries to affect energy intensive goods is likely to have trade effects. And disputes over those trade effects could easily degenerate into actual trade disputes. The EU is already pursuing this type of dialogue at various levels, including both the new structured dialogue on trade and environmental sustainability at the WTO. So far, the US and China are conspicuously absent from that process. The EEC has also proposed a transatlantic green trade agenda with the United States to discuss these issues bilaterally, and presumably if they can reach agreement to sort of plurilateralize any results of that process. Unfortunately, the US is not quite as advanced in its thinking on trade and climate at this point, but the Biden administration did indicate in its recently released 2021 trade agenda that it is considering developing a US carbon border adjustment system So I do think there's common ground between the U.S. and the EU that could be the basis for a dialogue. And I think those talks could address three baskets of issues. First, there's the technical issues. How do you go about determining, for instance, the carbon intensity of products subject to border adjustments? If there's agreement on that, I think that will help to clear the path for moving on to issues like the policy design. How can different national climate policies be designed to function together to minimize leakage and trade distortion? It's extremely unlikely that you're going to get identical systems coming out of the US, the EU, Canada, other major economies. So the question is, how do you find a way that they can coexist in a way that energy intensive products are subject to some form of carbon pricing, but that you don't get double pricing of some products? And then finally, there is the question of legal status of these measures. How can we ensure that the relationship between trade rules and climate policy is complementary rather than a source of conflict? A starting point for that might be a simple peace clause while we work out all these other more complicated issues. Let's not let these escalate to WTO disputes before there's been a chance to try to talk through some of these issues. And I will stop there, but I'd be glad to attempt to.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that quick run through of what I know is an enormous kind of dossier of possible facts and explanations. Thank you very much, Matthew. There's a couple of questions here. One of them was for you, Matthew Porterfield, and one was for Bernd Lange, but he's unfortunately had to go to argue with China about something completely different. So he's not with us anymore. So I'll put them both to you. They're quite technical. They're about allowances, and I think you partially answered the first question, and it was this: it's from Christopher Morgan. He says, "Do you believe we can have both a CBAM and free allowances, or do you believe it would be more simple to phase out free CO2 allowances and have every company pay for CO2 embedded in their products?" And I think you answered to that by saying you didn't know at this stage which way it was going. But what do you say to that?
Well, it would theoretically, you could have some sort of regime where the free allowances were designed so that they would not be redundant with the border adjustments. It would certainly be more simple to shift to a system just of border adjustments. And I do think there's going to be increasing pressure on the system of free allowances, even absent a border adjustment. We're already seeing that with, right now, the US is moving towards countervailing duties on a very narrow class of products, some components of giant industrial pumps used for hydraulic fracturing from Italy and Germany, I think. I would guess that that's only the beginning of that trend, and that other countries are going to start to look at the competitive effects of some of the free allowances. So it would certainly be simpler and less likely to run into trade problems to eliminate the free allowances as a CBAM is phased in.
Thank you very much. We're sort of beginning to run out of time. So I'm going to just ask each of you one question, I think, just to round off this session, which I know, we've barely touched on what is a fantastically complex area of law and policy and diplomacy and everything else. Matthew, I was really struck by something you said about the Biden administration having thoughts about its own carbon border adjustment mechanism. I wonder if you could sort of elaborate a bit on that and well, briefly, but also just to sort of explain why then is John Kerry so lukewarm about the European proposal? Or is it that he thinks that this is something that ultimately should be an international process with a sort of common carbon price that would solve all the problems before anyone needs to bring in their own regional border adjustment mechanisms?
Well, I think there's always a preference for multilateral solutions if possible. I don't see that being possible in the near term on this issue. In the U.S. stance on border adjustments is somewhat self-contradictory, and arguably we have it backwards. In the EU, you started with your domestic carbon pricing program, and now you're talking about how to apply it to internationally traded products. In the U.S., there's broad support for border adjustments. Biden supported it during the campaign. Even proponents of the Green New Deal have called, the Green New Deal itself calls for border adjustments. There's less consensus on what exactly it is that we would be adjusting. There's not the consensus on what the domestic carbon price is. So it's always easier to tax the internationally traded products than it is necessarily to impose the domestic price. I think we will be moving towards a more coherent position on that. But we're several years behind the EU, I think, in just considering how these different pieces fit together.
Thank you very much. And then Vangelis Vitalis, who you must have been up since about 4:30, I calculate. If you can just sort of tell us how you see the future. You know, I mean, do you think this is going to end up as a kind of horrible brawl in the WTO, or is it sort of moving towards a situation where the EU is going to be able to negotiate with the other great trading blocs and indeed countries like New Zealand to try and resolve these issues before they become a WTO source of conflict?
Look, I mean, I really hope not. I hope that it doesn't descend into a brawl, as you said. I think the risk is there, and that is one of our big worries, is that there is a retaliatory tit-for-tat exchange. And I mean, it's quite possible that you have a tit-for-tat kind of quote-unquote trade war on this, combined with a case being taken in Geneva. That's assuming, of course, that we have a functioning appellate body there. So I think the risks are real, and a lot of those risks can be mitigated. I don't say they can be eliminated, but they can be mitigated as far as possible by really working on the kinds of guidelines or those principles that I tried to outline, you know, non-discrimination, transparency, but above all, consultation. It comes to my point about the due diligence, really doing the work to do it once and do it right, because it is a very challenging thing to do properly. I did want to observe, though, that it's really important that we don't lose sight of the fact that the CBAM is just one tool in a toolbox. There are a number of others. I do think it's really important that we not lose sight of some of what I would actually describe as low-hanging fruit. So, for example, it is great to hear the European Union with its initiative in Geneva. I did want to draw attention to an initiative that a number of us have been running in Geneva for a number of years, unfortunately without the support of the European Union, and that's on fossil fuel subsidy reform. So it would be terrific to have, you know, if you actually reform fossil fuel subsidies and you could eliminate those, that's actually 10 to 12% of the climate change mitigation action that we actually need now. This isn't some radical thought that New Zealand is proposing. It's actually what the G20 has been saying since 2009. Since 2009. So there are some straightforward things that can be done quickly. And I would also observe that President Biden's executive order has already said that by 2022, he wants to ensure that no federal funds are used to subsidize fossil fuels. So I think there is a really important moment here that we could all work together using trade rules to actually drive change, and think that the CBAM alongside other trade measures can actually make a real difference. But I didn't want us to lose sight of the fact that there are other pretty quick, low-hanging fruit we could actually get on with now. And we would, you know, from our perspective, there's the agreement on climate change, trade and sustainability that we're negotiating. There's the initiative we're running in Geneva and have been running for a number of years. We would love the support of the people listening here today, this morning in New Zealand, in the afternoon in France. There's lots of things we can do to work together. I think we all share the objective here of making Paris effective, and that trade needs to contribute to dealing with the climate change challenge we all face.
So the EU's got the right aims, but the devil is in the detail, as several people have said, and there are other ways of doing some of the things they need to do in the months and years, and indeed decades ahead. Yeah. So
I think we need to move on multiple tracks.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Vangelis Vitalis, and Matthew Porterfield, to you, and also to Bernd Lange, who had to go back to the European Parliament. Thank you to all of you also who've been listening to this session. We've now got a couple of short interventions from two French ministers. Barbara Pompili is the Environment Minister, and Jean-Yves Le Drian, the Foreign Minister. So thank you for that session. And now we can move on to the next stage. Thank you.
Dear friends, I'm truly sorry I was not able to be with you all today. The negotiations on the draft bill Climate and Resilience are intense, but I deeply wanted to share with you some thoughts, because the very rich exchanges you had today demonstrates it once again. Nothing is done yet, but the time is of the utmost urgency. As the UN Secretary General stressed recently, the world is still lagging behind its commitments. If nothing changes, the Paris Agreement target will not be met. So now is the time for action. We need to rise up. We need to be innovative, technically but also legally. We need to do more and to do it faster. Yes, on the climate battleground, some good news have come recently. Major economies around the world are pledging for climate neutrality by 2050. More and more companies are shifting. Investors are adopting new frames of reference. Europe has committed to achieve 55% emission reductions by 2030, making it the most ambitious continent on Earth. And of course, the United States are back in the game. I had the pleasure to welcome John Kerry in Paris last week. Things are moving fast on this side. It gives hope for this very important year ending by COP26. We all know that there is no alternative. We must make the decade of action a reality. And Europe has built strong tools to reduce our greenhouse gases emissions. The EU ETS carbon market is the biggest in the world. With its carbon price above 40 euros per ton this week, despite the COVID crisis, a serious symbol of maturity. But we have to look at the situation obviously. And one of the main challenges in designing climate policies for us, policymakers, is to reconcile climate ambition, public acceptance, and the competitiveness of our economy. Along the past decade, if emissions in Europe have decreased significantly, our carbon footprint has not decreased in the same proportion, which means that more and more of the goods we consume are produced outside Europe. We cannot continue to import goods on such a massive scale that would not be subject to the same constraints as those produced within the EU borders. We need to go further and still reinforce our carbon market. But to make it more acceptable for our people and businesses, we need another tool. The Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism is a key element for a just green transition. Addressing carbon leakage, it will ensure that our environmental efforts here do not lead to increased emissions abroad. As it would be the first policy ever to address directly our world carbon footprint. This greener consumption is a clear demand by our citizens. It will also ensure that European businesses will compete fairly, and it will create a strong incentive helping firms all over the world to scale up their process to reach ambitious environmental standards. That way, being perceived as fairer, climate action will be more and more acceptable. There is one last condition. A lot of you told it. This mechanism will have to be fully compatible with the WTO rules. Let's go on working on this key issue. So, dear friends, I want to thank you all, panelists and participants. Today's meeting was an important step on the path toward a new, innovative policy instrument to achieve our climate ambition. Of course, we will be happy to further discuss with all interested, EU Commission, fellow member states, or trading partners. And I am very confident, with your help, we will deliver.
Mesdames et messieurs, depuis plus de 10 ans, la France plaide pour que les Européens se dotent d'un mécanisme d'ajustement carbone aux frontières. Peu à peu, cette idée a fait son chemin, car il est de plus en plus clair qu'il s'agit de l'outil le plus efficace pour lutter contre le fléau de ce qu'on appelle les fuites de carbone. Elle désigne l'augmentation des émissions mondiales de gaz à effet de serre résultant de la délocalisation d'activités économiques fortement émettrices vers des pays tiers moins exigeants au plan environnemental et climatique. Ces fuites de carbone réduisent ainsi la portée de nos efforts en faveur du climat et leur acceptabilité pour nos citoyens et constituent, pour certains de nos partenaires, une incitation de fait à préserver dans une voie dont nous savons désormais qu'elle est une impasse pour nous tous. La Commission européenne s'est saisie du sujet qui figure en bonne place dans son pacte vert de 2019 et fera l'objet d'une proposition législative en juin. Et nous espérons qu'en s'appuyant sur les travaux conduits au second semestre par la présidence slovène du Conseil de l'Union européenne, la présidence française, qui débutera au 1er janvier 2022, pourra porter ce projet aussi loin que possible afin que sa mise en œuvre puisse commencer dès 2023. Notre ambition, c'est au fond que l'Europe continue à montrer la voie comme elle l'a fait tout au long des dernières années en se hissant à l'avant-garde de l'action climatique internationale. Depuis le succès de la COP 21, nous n'avons eu de cesse de défendre l'accord de Paris, parfois contre vents et marées. Et grâce à notre mobilisation, cet accord a tenu et c'était essentiel. Il y va de la survie, oui, de la survie de certains de nos partenaires. Je pense notamment aux petits États insulaires et aux pays du Sahel, où nous soutenons le projet emblématique de Grande Muraille Verte que le dernier One Planet Summit a permis de relancer. Car nous savons aussi qu'il n'y a pas de fatalité, nous pouvons encore agir, et nous devons agir maintenant, alors que les dérèglements climatiques commencent à montrer de plus en plus souvent leur terrible potentiel de destruction et de déstabilisation. C'est pourquoi nous avons pris en Europe nos responsabilités en nous fixant pour horizon la neutralité climatique dès 2050 et dès 2030 au plus tard une baisse d'au moins 55% de nos émissions de gaz à effet de serre par rapport à 1990, comme nous l'avons annoncé au seuil de cette année décisive pour l'avenir de notre planète. 2021 sera en effet l'année des 3 COP. La COP sur la biodiversité, la COP sur la désertification, mais aussi bien sûr la COP de Glasgow sur le climat, qui doit nous permettre de tracer ensemble une trajectoire ferme et précise pour tenir les objectifs de Paris. Limiter le réchauffement climatique bien au-dessous de 2 degrés et si possible à 1,5 degré, c'est ce que recommande la communauté scientifique, c'est ce qu'attendent nos concitoyens et c'est l'engagement historique que nos pays ont pris collectivement en 2015. La France et ses partenaires appellent donc l'ensemble des parties à présenter au plus vite des contributions déterminées au niveau national révisé et des stratégies de long terme qui soient à la hauteur des enjeux. La stratégie des Européens, aujourd'hui nous sommes convaincus qu'elle doit passer par un mécanisme d'ajustement carbone aux frontières. Et dire cela, ce n'est pas vouloir transformer l'Europe en forteresse verte, non seulement parce que ce n'aurait absolument aucun sens du point de vue de la lutte pour le climat, qui est un défi global, mais aussi parce que ce serait renoncer à l'ouverture, renoncer aux échanges, et donc renoncer à ce que nous sommes, et à ce que, sans naïveté, nous voulons continuer à être. Soyons clairs, contrairement à ce que redoutent certains, ce que nous proposons ne relève pas du protectionnisme climatique. Les mécanismes d'ajustement carbone doivent être en tout point conformes aux règles de l'OMC. C'est pour nous une évidence et le mécanisme européen n'y fera pas exception. Il devra répondre à une finalité strictement environnementale. Il devra prendre en compte les politiques climatiques des pays tiers afin de ne pas être discriminatoire. Notre stratégie, c'est tout simplement de renforcer la cohérence de notre politique climatique, tout en tirant l'ensemble de nos partenaires vers le haut, car nous ne saurions accepter que nos efforts sur le sol européen se soldent par un déplacement de la production et donc par un accroissement des émissions de gaz à effet de serre dans des régions du monde qui ne partagent pas encore notre degré d'ambition. Et c'est une question d'efficacité, c'est une question de cohérence vis-à-vis de nos concitoyens, de nos entreprises à qui nous demandons déjà beaucoup. Comme nous le faisons sur le terrain de la finance climat, où nous mobiliserons dorénavant 6 milliards d'euros par an, nous voulons contribuer avec ce nouvel outil incitatif à une meilleure régulation de la mondialisation au service de nos biens communs, en gardant l'esprit d'ouverture et l'attachement au multilatéralisme qui sont au cœur de notre projet européen. Voilà en quelques mots, mesdames et messieurs, le sens que nous donnons à ce dispositif indispensable. J'espère que vos échanges d'aujourd'hui permettront de poser des jalons utiles en vue de l'adoption en Europe, mais aussi ailleurs, des mécanismes d'ajustement carbone dont nous avons tous besoin.